You okay with that? You're okay with that?
I'm okay with that. That's the recommendation I got.
Okay. I had a couple of questions as that came up that people talked to me about. Is there anything in the bill? Can you point out in the bill where it says that this has to be disaster? That there has to be a disaster related. Federally declared disaster area.
I think that's, if you look at the bottom of page 3, where it talks about the federal funding requirement, you wouldn't, if you look at line 33, you wouldn't receive funding under the Water Resources Development Act or federal program providing assistance specifically for hazard mitigation unless you had been part of a federally declared disaster. So I don't think it specifically states it, but it isn't, it's inherent as part of that.
Is there any reason why we wouldn't have it in there?
I don't know that there's any.
I think we started with it then, and then I think if we did the research on that section, it just seemed like we needed to repeat it.
Unless we find a reason for it to be problematic, I don't know that we would have a problem with adding that phrase in there.
And then the other one is on page 3, line 31. Page 4. Yeah, page 3, line 31. Project has been approved to receive financial assistance in an amount equal to. Is there a difference between approved and actually getting the money?
Well, this question I think came up too in the Appropriations Subcommittee, and I think that right now, it's my understanding is that this project has been approved by the Corps of Engineers and is included in the WRDA Act, but that act has not been approved by Congress yet. So that's kind of where we are in that process.
The west side.
Right. So that's.
East side.
So we would. So I think if we would read this, that means if you've been approved by the Corps of Engineers, because it says approved to receive this financial under the Federal Water Resources Development Act. So that doesn't require that the Congress has necessarily approved your funding. That would be kind of the next step. That's how I read that language.
So the Congress funds doesn't
part of it is some kind of gap between approval and Congress actually taking action on funding. And so at least initially, we were looking at is the intent is to get moving on the east side and start as soon as possible. And so once the approval is there, by Farm Board and accepting word of recommendation, then they go ahead and start construction, mitigation funds on, and it's up to them to get it.
What would happen if you got approval, the project proceeded, and then the approval didn't lead to obtaining the dollars?
Well, you have a total cost of the project. If you don't receive federal funding, under this language as we read it, the Cedar Rapids project specifically has met this threshold because they have been approved, as is written today. If you didn't receive the $65 million, then the match, both the match part and the whole size of the project would grow by that $65 million.
So the match that's written in this language is the check that the approval moves into actual dollars.
Yeah, but in essence, the full cost of the project that goes up from $300 million. I'm just talking project specific here; it'll be different for other projects, but the total cost would go from $300 million to $365. I think that there's language in here that makes the state's sales tax the last dollar in. So that money wouldn't necessarily come in until you would know that you've got the federal funding.
Well, I think making anything dependent upon the act of Congress
but the fact that the Corps of Engineers has included this in the wording bill, which, by the way, doesn't get taken up every year, takes a while. Again, making it depend upon an act of Congress is the standard. It would be a little high.
Those are just two questions I have. Is there any comments or points people want to make? Let me get Virginia, and then I'll get you this.
Before we broke, somebody said something about 10-year program.
I think that's incorrect. I think it's actually 20 years.
Where's that?
The 20 years is on, if you go to page 19, line 14. Where basically it puts the...
What section? Ours doesn't have
Section
pages.
16. So, yeah, good point. Section 16, the first paragraph, number 1, says that the governmental entity shall not receive remittances for sales tax revenue under this chapter after 20 years. So that's the maximum number of years that you would receive the sales tax.
So you have to get your application in by January 1st, 2016.
It has to be approved by January 1.
Right. And you could keep getting money until 2036.
Yes.
Essentially. Up to $30 million a year.
15 for each project. One project, the maximum that a project could receive is $15 million, and the maximum total of all projects that this board could approve is $30 million from the sales tax income.
I think the 20 years is because it's possible to sell bonds. You do a flood mitigation project as quickly as you can. You don't do it over a 20-year period, depending on the state cash flow. You base your bond sales on that revenue.
Okay, thank you.
And that effectively caps the amount of state assistance for one project to $300 million, 20 years times 15 million.
Okay.
Could somebody give me a hypothetical of how one community like Cedar Rapids could have two different projects at once qualifying for up to $15 million each annually?
I think that would be difficult because both projects would have to be separate projects, and so both projects would separately have to be approved by the Corps of Engineers to receive funding under the WRDA requirement or this other mitigation. Plus, you're going to require with that 50% local match. You would in essence, so that would in essence be $30 million of local match each year that would be required. And so I don't know that there's anything in the bill that specifically prohibits that. But it's sort of
There will be competition for this immediately, not just from Cedar Rapids.
But or maybe not just Cedar Rapids, but what would be the situation in which any community might, have two applications in or two separate projects going on that would qualify?
we don't foresee that, and in fact, that's why the language talks about
no language.
Yeah, but I mean, if that's something that you would
Well,
want.
I mean, it just seems like
If you want to do it, that's...
I don't. I mean, I thought that when I've got the sense if it's worded, $30 million in the aggregate or $15 million for any particular project that somebody perhaps had in mind that no.
No, I was just, I think that was we kind of knew roughly potentially the cost of the Cedar Rapids project, and that's where the $15 million and the $30 million. But it's not envisioned that they would approve two $15 million projects. But again, if there was a desire to add language saying that if a city is approved for one project or an applicant entity, they cannot make a second application for funding under either of these two funds, we certainly would be open to that concept.
Anything else from the legislature before I go to Lisa?
I see some possibility in that, for instance, in order for Des Moines to have a tax increment, they have to work out an arrangement with West Des Moines to be part of this. Because the increments in West Des Moines, if you prohibit any specific partnership like that from having, West Des Moines has a river run through it. So I think the board would make it almost impossible for the city to double dip. But on the other hand, you might have unintended consequences if you say that only one city in a county or something. I'd be worried about that.
Yep.
I think you gotta trust your board.
I don't think we want to limit it to like one city in the county anyway, because it wouldn't be fair to the other cities that may have had to work a little bit extra, or, you know, just because Cedar Rapids got something doesn't mean that payroll should.
I believe that in this bill, a city and county can partner up
Yeah.
to develop that increment. So I think you're getting into dicey area, and you have to depend on yourself, your oversight as a legislature, and your board.
Loaded question, I'm sorry, ladies, to keep prolonging
Oh, that's
this going on each. Just thinking out loud here, that there's 4 public people, what is there to prevent the 4 citizens from being from Cedar Rapids?
Well,
The governor and the politics of the government
Politics of the Senate.
and the politics of the
yeah,
Senate.
right, that's a confirmation process.
Okay.
I think that's very unlikely. Almost always, the governor's appointments try to do a geographic
Yeah.
dispersal, partisan dispersal, gender dispersal, and so on.
Yeah, and I don't think the Senate would ever okay something like that. Although if we allow I would like an amendment to allow the confirmation process to be approved by the House. I think we'd have better members, and I think they'd be more closer to the people, but I probably shouldn't have that on that.
Actually, what if we did an amendment that the Cedar County supervisors?
Cedar County Supervisor should have a say. Absolutely, thank you, I'll write that down.
Newly elected.
Wait, so you have some questions?
Yeah, I have some questions. I was unclear on did you say that the federal government, Congress just needs to authorize or actually allocate the money before this works? Just authorize. And I think they've already done that for the east side, haven't they? They just haven't allocated them.
The Corps of Engineers.
The Corps of
Corps of
Engineers
Engineers
has
about their
that.
government.
Right.
Not Congress.
But Congress hasn't done their first step? Okay, so this bill can go into effect just by Congress. You know how they authorize and then they don't allocate, they don't fund it. So this bill can go into effect if Congress just authorizes it and they're still not allocating the funds, they're not funding it?
Well, first of all, Tom corrected that. It's the Corps of Engineers that puts down the list of approved projects that meet the cost-benefit ratio of Corps of Engineer funding. They have a very strict way of looking at that. Once they put it on the list for wording, which is the legislative act for funding, then it would be approved. Congress then sometimes takes years before they take up the word of bill for actual approval.
So,
And then the list isn't always fully funded, and the list goes into the next word of bill. So making it dependent upon an act of Congress, I think, would be harmful to the communities of the state.
so this isn't ensuring that federal funds need to come toward this? Okay, see, I thought, and then also,
Well, let me just add,
okay,
there is you have the order requirement. So you also then, or other federal programs providing assistance specifically for hazard mitigation. And so that would include community development block grant money that's used for hazard mitigation. And that's important because lots of cities have received community development block grant money for hazard mitigation. Cedar Rapids is one of them. But and that's important language because that means that helps incorporate other cities. Now, you also have to make sure that it has to be, that money, that CDBG money would have to equal 20% of the total project cost or $30 million. And I don't know if it does in Cedar Rapids.
On the west side, it definitely does, because the acquisitions and the demolitions count for the mitigation. And I think in the federal registers, when HUD was allocating those CDBG disaster funds, there was also, it said that they can count as local match, even though it's...
Well, but I guess the important thing is, I think because the CDBG language is also in here, I don't think we should get too hung up on, okay, it's been approved by the Corps, the Congress has funded it or not, because you also have that language about other hazard mitigation federally that is important because lots of cities are eligible for that.
So this isn't contingent on getting funds from the federal?
Well, yes, it is. It is contingent, but it is contingent on having federal approval or federal funds received under community development block grant. So there's two ways in which you can meet that requirement.
For instance, they would never, in my community, we would never meet the cost benefit ratio of Corps of Engineers. So the CPDG part of it would be important to smaller communities that don't have that value.
But it is contingent in code with no loophole. Bad choice of word, but that's what that that it has to be in a federally declared disaster area. And I know that's...
And again, I think we can go back, and if there's an interest in adding that it is in an area that was declared a federal disaster, I don't see any reason why that we couldn't add that language to do that. That's an interest of ours.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of the comfort zone
Sure.
No problem.
legislators.
These would be significant disasters. And during the original bipartisan House Senate discussion group that took place for quite a while last summer, Representative Thomas served on that and pointed out that downtown Decatur was also flooded, and they wouldn't ever meet that word of kind of level. So the CDBG requirement comes from those kinds of communities that then would be eligible for the fund if we were to appropriate any money into that fund. There is no money in this fund now.
Well, I'm trying to think if it's a more basic question, if it matters, because if we have accountability and we have the match in code, and we have the buy-in of the local community, and ultimately you have the total cost of the project, if you don't get federal funding, it just puts more onus on the local government to get those dollars, and they have to, as Cedar Rapids has shown, they got to convince the people to do that. If the people aren't convinced of at least going that route, then you're not going to get the money for the project per se.
And Mr. Kaufman, I think if I remember right, Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, there was some discussion about that, specifically saying that early on in the work group, and I think that the choice was made not to make it sort of a federally declared disaster area because of the preventative nature of the bill, that if there is a community that applied for, received approval for either community development block grant hazard mitigation funds or Corps of Engineer funds, that they wouldn't have to wait to be flooded to try to take action to try to prevent it. So I think that was one of the things that, and like I said, Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, that made this program more widely applicable was that, true, there were 88 counties in the 2008 disaster, and I don't know how many from 2010, and I don't know how many from 2011 or early 2012 that were flooded, but some of those communities may not have been in a federally declared disaster area, but if they did flood and they were able to secure a federal commitment for doing this, I think that just makes it more widely applicable.
Did you have another question?
Yeah. So is there no cap on this bill at all? There's nothing to prevent Cedar Rapids from applying for 3 different projects and getting $15 million a year. Well, actually, it'd be 2, right? Because the cap is $30 million per year. And it's not automatic, it's 15, right? They can say 15 for this project, $5 million for this project. And they can be receiving it for up to 20 years?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's not really a cap. I guess it'd be 30 million times 20 years, so this is a $600 million bill, basically, right? Okay, so in Cedar Rapids, you know, when I passed this out, of course, and they had not applied or tried to get any money for flood protection on the east or west side, there was one IDOT grant that they did submit, and it was for to protect 20 homes over the Cottage Grove area. We've had flooding in the Indian Creek area. So, you know, they didn't apply for anything to help the 2,000 flood victims, but they wanted to protect these 20 homes in the Cottage Grove area. What is going to prevent Cedar Rapids from having this project here and then this project over here, you know, to protect those, you know, those homes?
Correct me if I'm wrong, that's a further statement from an expert on the bill to get, but I think the answer to that is the city council specifically asking for those funds and then mostly the state board granting those 3 projects.
Because they'd be in competition with any other community that met this criteria.
That's correct. Each project would have to meet the threshold that's already set out in here, like the approved for federal funding, the non-public match, the local match. So you couldn't sort of apply for if you did apply for those projects, then you'd have to, each one of them would have to meet their own threshold. So, and Representative Coffman's correct, that the board.
But you're in the same time you're saying that we don't have to have, this is not contingent on receiving federal funds, which most likely there wouldn't be any for Indian Creek.
It has to be approved for the receipt of federal funds.
Just by the Army Corps, not Congress.
It has to be, actually, there's a couple of programs in here. One of them is the Water Resources Development Act, which would require Army Corps of Engineer approval, and others wouldn't. Others would require whatever department or agency, like CDBG, I guess would be HUD, hazard mitigation. So you'd have to be approved for those.
Yeah, I think that the scope of it makes it impossible because you would have to, the amount of federal funding you would have to receive. But again, if there's an interest in saying that, the applicant has to be a governmental entity, which can be a city or a county. So if you want to say, okay, that governmental entity, if you're awarded, then that governmental entity cannot apply again. That to us, I don't think it's significantly problematic, just because I don't think that you're going to really see a situation in which Lisa's explaining. But so we're comfortable with that. If there's an interest in,
I think that would be problematic.